In November of 1983, there was no announcement, no alarm, and no public warning. Governments did not issue statements. Citizens went to work. The world appeared unchanged. Inside military command structures, a routine exercise was underway. It had a name. It had procedures. It had been conducted before. Nothing about it was meant to attract attention. What mattered was not what the exercise intended to simulate, but how it was interpreted. Decisions were being made quietly, based not on certainty, but on assumptions. No missiles were launched. No cities were evacuated. No history books marked the moment. Yet, for several days, the possibility of nuclear war rested not on orders, but on restraint, not on commands, but on silence. This is the story of Able Archer 83, a NATO exercise that ended without consequence, and the events that history almost forgot because nothing visibly happened at all. Able Archer was not a secret operation. It was a scheduled NATO command exercise designed to test procedures, communication, and decision-making under simulated conditions. Exercises like this were routine. They occurred regularly throughout the Cold War, often with little public awareness and rarely with public concern. Able Archer did not involve troops maneuvering in the field. It was conducted inside command structures through messages, timelines, and simulated orders. Its purpose was not to rehearse combat, but to test whether leaders and systems could function as scenarios escalated from conventional conflict toward nuclear decision-making. In theory, the exercise existed to prevent disaster. By rehearsing responses, NATO believed it reduced the chance of confusion during a real crisis. For years, exercises like Able Archer ended quietly. They concluded, reports were filed, and the world continued without noticing. In 1983, that assumption would be tested in ways NATO planners did not anticipate. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered a more unstable phase. Relations between NATO and the Soviet Union had deteriorated, not through open conflict, but through mistrust, misinterpretation, and hardened assumptions. Both sides believed the other was capable of launching a sudden nuclear strike. Both sides believed surprise would be decisive, and both sides believed they could not afford to be wrong. In the West, military planning focused on deterrence. Exercises were designed to demonstrate readiness, control, and the ability to escalate in a measured way. In the Soviet Union, intelligence assessments painted a different picture. NATO exercises were not always seen as rehearsals. They were sometimes viewed as possible cover for a real attack. This belief was not paranoia in the abstract. It was reinforced by intelligence failures, historical precedent, and a political climate that assumed deception as a matter of policy. By 1983, both sides were watching each other closely, looking not for reassurance, but for signs of intent. Able Archer would take place inside this environment, where interpretation mattered as much as reality, and caution could look indistinguishable from preparation. The year was 1983. It was one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, though few people at the time would have described it that way. Public life continued normally. Governments issued no warnings. There were no emergency broadcasts, no visible signs that the world was entering a period of heightened risk. Behind the scenes, however, relations between NATO and the Soviet Union had sharply worsened. Trust was minimal, communication was strained, and recent events had made both sides more sensitive to perceived threats. Earlier that year, the Soviet military had mistakenly identified a civilian airliner as a hostile aircraft. The incident reinforced fears that errors, not intent, could trigger irreversible consequences. At the same time, new weapon systems were being deployed in Europe, and these systems reduced warning times and increased pressure on decision-makers to respond quickly. Military planners understood this environment as fragile. Intelligence analysts understood it as volatile. And yet, routine exercises continued as scheduled. Able Archer was planned inside this moment, a period where misinterpretation was not hypothetical, but increasingly plausible. Able Archer was a NATO command post exercise. Its purpose was to test procedures, communication, and decision-making at the highest levels of military command. Exercises like this were not unusual. They occurred regularly throughout the Cold War and were generally understood to be controlled simulations, not rehearsals for real conflict. Able Archer 83 differed in important ways. For the first time, the exercise included new elements meant to increase realism, particularly at the political and command level. These elements included the transmission of coded messages, the movement through distinct escalation phases, and the simulation of nuclear release procedures. Unlike earlier exercises, Able Archer 83 avoided some of the familiar signals that marked it as routine. Communications were more secure, participation was more selective, and the scenario unfolded with greater discipline. From inside NATO, these changes were viewed as improvements. They reflected lessons learned from past exercises and a desire for greater operational realism. From outside NATO, those same changes were not necessarily reassuring. They altered patterns that Soviet intelligence had come to expect. In a climate already shaped by suspicion, the absence of familiar signals could be interpreted, not as restraint, but as concealment. While Able Archer unfolded inside NATO, it was being observed from the outside. Soviet intelligence did not experience the exercise as procedure, but as information. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had become increasingly concerned that a nuclear attack might be disguised as an exercise. This belief was not theoretical. It had been formalized. Soviet intelligence was operating under a program known as Ryan. Its purpose was to detect indicators that a surprise nuclear strike was being prepared. The program relied on patterns, changes in communication behavior, unusual command activity, shifts in alert posture. Signals that, taken alone, might seem insignificant. Able Archer produced several of these indicators at once: increased message security, restricted participation, a realistic progression through escalation stages. From the Soviet perspective, these changes did not suggest caution. They suggested concealment, what NATO considered improved realism. Soviet analysts could interpret as preparation, and preparation, in a system built on worst-case assumptions, could not be ignored. The exercise was no longer being evaluated as an exercise, it was being assessed as a possible precursor to something irreversible. As Able Archer progressed through its simulated escalation phases, Soviet military planners began to consider the possibility that the exercise might not end as expected, and this assessment did not come with certainty. It came with enough doubt to require preparation. Preparation did not involve public alerts or visible mobilization. There were no announcements, no declarations. Instead, small adjustments were made inside existing command structures meant to preserve readiness without provoking response. Certain nuclear-capable units were placed on heightened alert. Aircraft were readied. Command posts reviewed procedures. These actions were not extraordinary on their own. What mattered was their timing and the assumptions guiding them. Each side believed it was acting cautiously. Each believed escalation could be avoided through discipline, and each believed the other was capable of deception. At no point was a decision made to launch. At no point was war declared, but the space for misinterpretation narrowed as readiness replaced observation and silence replaced reassurance. As Able Archer approached its final phases, the margin for misunderstanding narrowed further. What had begun as observation had become readiness. What had been analysis was now time-sensitive judgment. From the Soviet perspective, the exercise appeared to be progressing through a plausible sequence for a real nuclear conflict: political authorization, command escalation, simulated release procedures. The danger was not that NATO intended to attack. The danger was that intent no longer mattered. What mattered was whether the signals could be interpreted in time to prevent an irreversible response. Decision windows compressed, assumptions replaced confirmation, and restraint depended not on policy but on individual judgment exercised under uncertainty. At this point, a launch would not have required panic or aggression. It would have required only the belief that waiting carried greater risk than acting. For several days, the outcome rested on silence, on caution, and on the hope that routine would remain routine, even as its signals suggested otherwise. Able Archer concluded without incident. The exercise reached its final phase, then stopped. No forces were deployed. No weapons were launched. The simulation was simply terminated. From NATO's perspective, the exercise had been a success. Procedures were tested. Communications functioned. The scenario ended as planned. There was no public announcement, no press conference, no explanation. Able Archer ended the same way it had begun, without public attention. Only later would it become clear that the absence of consequence did not mean the absence of risk. In that silence, not action, had been the deciding factor. For several days, the world had moved forward without knowing how close it had come to a decision that could not be reversed. For years, Able Archer was understood as an uneventful exercise. It did not appear in headlines, it was not discussed publicly, and it left no visible trace in the historical record at the time. Only later, through declassified documents and intelligence reviews, did it become clear how the exercise had been interpreted outside NATO and how close misjudgment may have come to consequence. These findings did not reveal a single mistake. They revealed a system operating as designed, one that depended on assumptions, limited information, and the hope that restraint would prevail. In the years that followed, changes were made, communication channels were improved, exercises were adjusted, and greater attention was paid to how actions might be perceived, not just how they were intended. Able Archer did not end the Cold War, but it quietly reshaped how risk was understood, not as a matter of intent alone, but as a product of interpretation under pressure. Its lesson was simple and unsettling, that the most dangerous moments are not always those marked by crisis, but those that pass unnoticed. This was Able Archer. A moment that passed without headlines, without warnings, without public memory. Echoes of Silence is a documentary series examining real events. History moved past too quickly. This was the first episode.